Today we're going to look at radio, television, and online video and how we can integrate more of our public relations efforts into these different venues. This will be a slight extension of what we did the previous week when we were looking more specifically at social media. So today the focus is on public service announcements, which is what you will be creating in class this week. So we know that even though there is a decrease in individuals subscribing to cable and using television in the traditional sense, instead purchasing subscriptions to Netflix or Hulu or HBO Go, there is still a large reach, and it still does make sense that you consider this as a channel for reaching out to your target audience, especially based on who your target audience is. Radio still has a very, very large reach. We know there are a number of people who commute every day. In a lot of ways, they are captive. They are in their cars with nothing to do until they arrive at work, or they get through the traffic. And certainly, we know people can listen to music through their phones or podcasts. But if we do think about podcasts, many of them are produced based on the support of sponsors. So there are opportunities there for us in public relations to make our messages heard. Very, very cost effective though, especially if we're looking at certain demographic groups. So if we're looking at targeting individuals in the upper middle class, we might think about something like NPR. If we're looking at a younger group, if we work on behalf of a new bar, restaurant, or club, then looking at radio stations that reach out to that demographic is going to position us for success. Right? And the other nice thing is that there's a lot of research through radio and television. We're focusing on radio right now. But we're able to be very, very specific in terms of how we are targeting our desired audience members. With that in mind, we can submit radio news releases, and this is where we just submit a script to a radio station so that the on-air personalities will read it. What is essential then is that it's very clear, that it's easy to read, it's formatted correctly, so that the radio personality does our organization proud, right? So that they're not stumbling over words, that they know clearly that if we tell them it can be read in a 30-second spot, that they can actually comfortably read that in a 30-second spot or a 60-second spot. We also want to make sure that just as we don't ask them to cram too much into too short of period, we don't want to tell them this is enough content for 60 seconds and they're done after 40 seconds, because then there's dead air. Right? So that is an option, and that's going to align pretty clearly with what we'll do with our public service announcements, and we'll get to that in a couple slides. Radio news release, and this was presuming that the on-air news personalities would read and deliver the information. An audio news release is when you or members in your organization actually create the audio news release. So that means that you are sending typically an MP3 file where the sound bites are recorded. Maybe you did it, maybe you hired a voice actor or actress in order to develop this audio news release. But what comes with that is a little bit more cost, but you know exactly how that news release is going to sound when it is delivered. So you do get more control, and that's what you're paying for. So this leads us to public service announcements. Public service announcements, commonly referred to as PSAs, they are free, which is wonderful, right? So like a press release, it's not something that we're having to look at our budget to pay for, but it has to be there. There are a couple buts, right? The first one, this has to be for public interest. So typically it is for a voluntary organization, a nonprofit, something that is dedicated to serving the greater good of listeners, right? So you might think about this in terms of vaccinations, of flu seasons, if we want to help people understand where they can access free literacy help, right? Or help in preparing taxes. Anything that is for the greater good makes sense for content for public service announcement. The examples that I will share with you in this week's module are based from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or a relevant organization, and making sure that on graduation night students aren't drinking and driving. Right? So we have to make sure that we pick a content area that aligns with our organization, but at the same time, these aren't specific advertisements or promotions for your organization. So Western Michigan University, for example, we would not do a PSA about all the benefits of applying and attending Western, but instead we might say, in concert with our local Kalamazoo Literacy Council, Western is partnering to make sure that we decrease the number of functionally illiterate adults in the Kalamazoo area. So in that sense, we're not necessarily promoting us as Western, but we're saying that we're working with this organization that is doing public service, right? Working toward a public good. So we know that public service announcements have to be based on something that serves a public interest. And we know that they're free. We're not paying for these. But also, less than 1% of all airtime is dedicated to PSAs. So we don't want to spend a lot of our time and attention dedicated to making this a major component of our promotional campaign, of our communication campaign. The other element that you need to consider too is, since radio stations aren't being reimbursed for this, since they're doing that on behalf of the government, they're not going to play these during peak drive times, right? It doesn't make sense, because during our AM and PM commute, we're going to make more money having paid advertisers give us money for those spots. So again, PSAs, I remember when I was working in the healthcare sector, my alarm went off at 5:30 every day, and I would frequently, when we were running PSAs, typically between 5:30 and 6 a.m., hear the PSA. Right? So I heard it, it was played. There are other folks who are up early getting ready, but again, that's not the same as between 7 and 8 a.m. or 7 and 9 a.m. or 5 and 6 p.m. Right? PSAs, or television PSAs. Some of you might have done some of these in COM 1000 or other courses. But again, the purpose is to promote a social change, a social cause, oftentimes a behavioral change. So as I mentioned before, the idea that we could do a PSA to make sure that people don't drink and drive. Like I said, there's no charge, but that also means it's uncontrolled media. So for the radio in particular, if we send these and ask the on-air personalities to read them, they might stumble, they might not play the music that we send along with it. We're not necessarily sure what it's going to look like when it is completed. Audience, on the other hand, the other thing too, it's typically a challenge to reach our audience in a very fine-tuned way here, because like we said, they're not played during peak broadcast hours, so we don't know if our audience will necessarily be up and plugged in and listening or watching at these particular times. In a fairly formulaic way, similar to your press release, I have examples in our module, but what we see is when we're doing these production scripts, they tend to be 2 columns and double spaced. Right? We do this in a way because we want to make sure that it's easy to retype if it's read live. And television production strips too are also done with the 2-column double space scripts. What you're going to see though are different acronyms used because in radio we don't need to tell the camera person how to pan or what to do in a particular shot, whereas with television we do need to do that. We need to provide that extra insight and guidance. What I want you to think about is, again, everything, who's the audience? Why are we doing this? What's in it for them, right? That's where you're thinking about the content, the goals, and needs, and as we noted, who the audience is. The other thing is we still have the opportunity when we're drafting this to make sure it sounds like our organization, to make sure it aligns with our mission, our vision, our goals, who we are, and how we see ourselves. The other option here is that we will always send a number of different length PSAs, both for radio and for television. So some typical formats I have listed here on the screen, 10 seconds through 60 seconds. For the purposes of this course, you're going to do 1 in 30 seconds and 1 in 60 seconds. It's going to be the same message focus, but obviously the one with 60 seconds is going to have a little bit more than the one with 30 seconds. And we do this in order to increase our chances of it actually being read. Right? So if a radio station has a break of 10 seconds, great. But if they only have one of 30 seconds and you send a 60-second spot, it's not able to get in that, right? There just isn't room. Oops, sorry about that. When you submit a PSA, whether it's for radio or television, typically you're going to do so in a package format. We used to send these in hard copy formats with the CD and notes. Now we can do this very easily through a zip folder and ship it along. But we have a cover letter that acknowledges what's the focus of the PSA, why is it important, why does it resonate with the radio station's viewers or the television station's viewers, listeners, audience members. We're going to acknowledge what we've included. So how many different scripts, what are the different lengths? And again, if we're sending these scripts and we know they're going to be read, especially for radio, we're going to use large font that's easy to read and to function through so that when it is live, it's done in a coherent manner. And then a lot of times organizations will include, either if it's done as a sample to emphasize how they see the radio spot being read, or if they've produced them themselves, they will include the recorded messages in a variety of different lengths, again from 10 seconds to 60 seconds, in order to increase the chances that it's heard on air. One, we always want to make sure that it's easy for our media outlet to use the PSA. I've said time and time again throughout this lecture that we do that by having different formats, but also making sure that our script is easy to read. If we're doing a television PSA, making sure that it is high resolution, that all the imagery is copyrighted, that we have access to use this. And the other thing here too is one option, depending on how many social justice causes your organization supports or works with, you might not want to do these on the cheap. So it might make more sense for you to record higher quality ones, especially if we recognize we're going to use them on a regular basis. In the healthcare setting, when we have something like Heart Health Month every February, it made sense for us to work with a production company to produce really high quality PSAs that were used because we knew we would be using those every February. If this is a one-time PSA that your organization is using, then maybe just sending the scripts to the radio station in a variety of formats is going to be enough. But just knowing that, again, PSAs, public service announcements, are for social justice causes. They're about enhancing the public good. They are free, which is nice, but it also means that it's uncontrolled, so we typically don't know what it's going to look like, and we don't know when it's going to air, but we can anticipate it's not going to be in prime time.